Hello students, happy to be with you today. This is a continuation of social psychology, the chapter that I wanted to do a little bit of more work with before we got to any more review work. So when I left you the other day, I asked you to look at that handout 74-3 on the fundamental attribution error, and I wanted you to think about yourself in those pairs of traits. So for instance, are you serious or are you merry? Are you subjective or are you analytic? Are you intense or are you calm? There's also another part that said depends on the situation. So when I asked you to do that, I'm interested to know if some of you said depends on the situation and how many times you said that. Now I want you to just think in your mind and go back to those trait pairs and think about a teacher. It can be me, it could be an English teacher, it could be a science teacher. Maybe it would be better to do a teacher who's not at the school anymore, so we don't have any bias in our head, maybe Mrs. Snyder. Think about then, what am I, or whichever teacher you have in your mind? Are we quiet or talkative? Are we steady or flexible? Are we cautious or bold? Or does it depend on the situation? So part of understanding the fundamental attribution error is the way we explain behaviors. So let me just give you an instance. If I were doing this attribution scale, I would, let's take the words realistic and idealistic. I would say I'm mostly realistic, but sometimes it depends on the situation. Am I skeptical or trusting? Well, that definitely depends on the situation. Am I quiet or talkative? That definitely depends on the situation. And am I uninhibited or self-controlled? Well, probably mostly self-controlled. Am I conscientious or happy-go-lucky? And so on and so forth. When you think about somebody else, it's much easier to put them in one of the categories rather than depending on the situation. So when we look at the fundamental attribution error, we often subject those traits to the person's characteristics rather than the situation. We underestimate the situation and we overestimate their disposition or their characteristics. And that's the attribution error, where we don't take into account really what the situation is. For ourselves, we do, but for others, we tend not to do it. And that's when I brought back, bringing that back to that idea yesterday of homelessness or unemployment or addiction or whatever it is. Let's just take addiction, for instance. Does a person who's an addict, is it because of personal characteristics? Are there some flaws, like they just were not ambitious enough to kick their habit, or they led themselves down the wrong path to abusing drugs and alcohol? Or was there a situation, did they get addicted to drugs because they had their wisdom teeth out and they were on Percocet for a very long time, and then very quickly they became addicted to opioids? So that's what you need to think about with the fundamental attribution error. And actually what I want you to do today and tomorrow are thinking about the fundamental attribution error when I ask you to watch a video. So I'm going to kind of quickly go on and talk about group behavior. And there's this big fancy word called deindividuation. Deindividuation is this loss of self-restraint that occurs in a group when you are anonymous. So if you are in a group situation and the group gets really amped up and you aren't going to be caught, or you can remain anonymous in this group, you tend to do things that you might not otherwise do. So this kind of famous quote, give a man a mask and he'll show you his true face. Well, this is what that anonymity brings. I had to put this picture right here because, as you know, I used to live in St. Louis, and this is a picture of Ferguson, Missouri. Ferguson, Missouri, when I lived there, was where Michael Brown was shot, and this was really the beginning of the of the movement of the police brutality, bringing light to police brutality, because police shot Michael Brown, and he had his hands up. However, stories came out later that he probably had been the guy who had just stolen something. But anyway, long story short, I remember watching these images coming across my television as I'm sitting in my house, knowing that this is happening just miles away from me. And if you look at that, they're looting. These young men, it looks like mostly, are looting this market and liquor store, and it's all boarded up. But you see what they have on their face. Most of them have their face covered, and so really all you can see is their eyes. This anonymity. And again, I bet you take one of these guys, and alone they would not have done it. Together in a group, when you lose your self-restraint and it gets real amped up, and you are pretty sure you're not going to get caught or you're not going to be singled out, that's when de-individuation happens. And it also brings about this cognitive dissonance. Oftentimes it does. This is when, usually it's afterward, this cognitive dissonance, this kind of break, this separation, if you will, then our attitudes and our actions don't coincide with the feelings that we have after doing these actions or making these decisions. So for example, let's say I was involved in this looting of this store, and I would have normally never have done that. But then afterward I think about that, and then I start to think, well, I would have never done that. However, I start making these decisions, or I start justifying these decisions because of something. I would say, well, I did it because. Now, if I'm less coerced, it means if I am not forced to do that, I have more dissonance. I have more of a disconnect between what I actually did and my feelings of it. If I'm more coerced, then I feel like it was okay. I mean, maybe it still wasn't right, but it was okay that I did that. We're motivated to justify our behavior. So for instance, the weapons of mass destruction in the Iraq War, during President Bush's term, when Saddam Hussein was still alive, we felt that Iraq had weapons of mass destruction. And then we found out that there weren't. And it was essentially like, oops, I guess there's no weapons of mass destruction. But he was still really bad. And so we had to take Saddam Hussein out. The whole reason we went to war with Iraq first and not Afghanistan was because we were looking for weapons of mass destruction. When we realized there weren't any there, then we have to try to justify why we did that. And we needed support for the war. So then we go and we're like, well, he violated all democratic principles and he was a tyrant, and he gave people no freedoms, so therefore it was fine. That's cognitive dissonance right there. All right, so other actions that influence our attitudes. There's something called the foot in the door phenomenon, and I'm sure if you are a child or even a student that you've done this before. It's when you know how somebody's going to slam the door in your face, but you stop your foot right in the threshold before they can stop it, and you're like, oh, but wait, one more thing. This is what the foot in the door phenomenon is. It's opposed to door in the face phenomenon. Door in the face phenomenon is when you ask for something big and the door gets slammed in your face. Foot in the door phenomenon is when you ask for a small request in order to get a larger request. So for instance, you want to go, I mean, let's not say right now, but you're 16 and you want to go on spring break with your friends to Cancun. I mean, no parent in their right mind would allow their 16-year-olds to go to Cancun by themselves with their friends. I mean, it just would be crazy. But maybe you could make a smaller request to eventually get there, maybe by the time you're 17 or something. So you kind of start with these smaller things like, okay, I won't go to Cancun for spring break, but maybe we can go to Minneapolis for spring break, just, the three of us girls or something like that. So it's making these small requests in order to gain a larger one. This was very much seen with POWs in the Korean War, for instance, but really all wars, Vietnam War included. They would make like little requests. They'd brainwash the POWs, the prisoners of war, into believing that communism was a good thing, and they would do like little things like have them run errands or give them like little favors, extra food or things like that, with no brutality. And then they would basically say, well, can you do a radio appeal for us, like propaganda, to say that like communism isn't bad and is actually really good and they're treating me really well here, all the while you are a prisoner of war. So this is called the foot in the door phenomenon. Part of this, and I'm a little bit kind of switching gears here, but a lot of it goes with this social role expected behavior. Remember, we have these behaviors that are expected of us, and some of us often play these roles without even knowing it. Remember how we had talked with Carl Jung and archetypes, how we kind of take on that role. Am I the hero? Am I the victim? Am I the wild youth? Am I the funny man, or whatever it happens to be, the comedic relief. When you are taking on these roles, everybody has kind of this role to play. And so here's what I want you to do. It's called the Stanford Prison Experiment. Now, there's a movie on Netflix that I definitely do not want you to watch. It's fine, but I do want you to watch this YouTube documentary, or this documentary that I have embedded here. I hope you can watch it. If you can't, please let me know. I don't think it should be blocked on your iPad, but you really do need to watch it. Now, keep in mind, you should definitely not watch this around younger kids, because even though this is a documentary, they still use the F word. And I'm going to let you watch it and view it without, prior consent, because this is a psychology class and it's a college class, and you need to absolutely know about the Stanford Prison Experiment. What the Stanford Prison Experiment did was really looked at this act, and so it was an experiment. This was completely, now you'll even hear it's an experiment within an experiment. But I want you to watch this documentary on the Stanford Prison Experiment. I think it's about 20 or 30 minutes. And then I want you to post a question, or a response, I should say, a response to a few questions that I have on a Padlet. This will all be under the chapter 16 Social Psych chapter. So watch the Stanford Prison Experiment and respond to one of the questions. One of the questions is going to be on the fundamental attribution error. So that's it. It'll just be a Padlet discussion after you watch this documentary. Have a great day.